Russia and Ukraine. War between Russia and Ukraine has begun decelerating while the world waits for it to conclude. After a Russian fighter jet shot down an American drone, the United States Navy responded with force. And Su-25 fighter jet from the Russian Air Force was shot down by US naval ships operating in the Black Sea. An unmanned U.S. Mach-9 aircraft was just shot down by a Russian Su-27 fighter jet over the Black Sea. With this UAV, the U.S. Air Force was planning a surveillance mission over the Black Sea. But the Russian warplanes crossed the boundary and flew into American territory, intercepting the unmanned aircraft system. The U.S. drone was harassed for 40 minutes by two Russian fighter fighters. A fresh deconfliction between Russia and the United States followed after Russian airplanes shot down a U.S. drone. Officials at the Pentagon were livid after Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an attack against the United States. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. Air Force will keep up its operations in the Black Sea despite Russia's best efforts to stop them. After first claiming that Russian airplanes had nothing to do with the downing of the U.S. unmanned aerial vehicle, the Russian government has since changed its story to say that the U.S. drone was shot down because it had crossed into Russian territory in violation of Russian law. The United States military conducted an operation in the Black Sea after Russia accepted the attack. The United States and Turkey, a NATO member and friend, have reached an agreement whereby the United States is granted permission by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to send naval vessels through the Istanbul Strait. The U.S. requested passage across the Istanbul Strait to the Black Sea, and Erdogan agreed. In addition, 6 U.S. Navy ships were stationed in the Black Sea, across the Bosphorus from Istanbul. Russian spies immediately raised the alarm when they learned that American warships had entered the Black Sea. The Russian leadership, fearing an invasion on the Crimean Peninsula by U.S. Navy ships, called for the deployment of the country's Air Force. 2 Russian Sukhoi 25 fighter planes have taken off and are headed for the Black Sea from Russian territory. For hours, Russian airplanes engaged in harassment flights near the region where U.S. Navy ships were stationed, eventually forcing the American vessels to leave the area. To cement his authority in the Black Sea, Vladimir Putin keeps the bulk of Russia's Navy vessels here. To ensure the safety of Crimea, Russia has stationed its largest navy in the port of Sevastopol for quite some time. Putin is making every effort to ensure that Crimea does not fall into enemy hands. As protests and riots have broken out in Crimea, Vladimir Putin has become increasingly irritated. There have been multiple attempts at sabotage against Russian military installations in Crimea by Ukrainian militants. Following Vladimir Putin's decision to partially mobilize the Russian armed forces, the vast majority of minority nationals residing in Russia's autonomous republics were conscripted into the Russian armed forces and deployed to the territory of Ukraine. The vast bulk of the troops was also handpicked right there on the Crimean Peninsula. A lot of smart people feel Putin had to be doing this on purpose. Experts say it's all part of Putin's long-term strategy of assimilating Russian society. The Russian issue worsens by the day. Putin started to get worried when explosions started happening in Crimea. There has been some spillover of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine onto Russian territory. The Russian troops stationed here were helpless while the Russian military headquarters burned down owing to explosions. After an explosion in the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia occupies, started fires at the headquarters in 2014, Russia mobilized to put them out. The explosions at the headquarters that Russia used as a military base against Ukraine remain a mystery. After the Russian army resumed its march into Ukraine, the Ukrainian military once again organized operations within Russia's borders. The Crimean Peninsula is of critical importance to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian leader has often promised that Crimea will be retaken in his addresses given in the newly independent territories. A red alert was declared after a fire broke out at a military barracks in Sevastopol, the location of Russia's largest Black Sea fleet. At the military headquarters, there are reportedly 185 Russian troops. The idea that Ukraine was responsible for the explosion was fueled by the fact that it happened in the Sevastopol region. Sevastopol, Russia, is home to a considerable number of Russia's long-range missile and air defense systems, which are guarded by the Navy. Despite Russia's assurances, the city of Sevastopol is now classified as a conflict zone. Due to the explosions and fires, grain supplies from Russia's Odessa region to Africa have been delayed. Putin has halted the transfer because he fears for the safety of the grain ships as well. The malfunction of an electrical device, according to Russian officials, caused the explosion. However, the Russian government often provides such explanations for any explosions that take place within Russia's borders, leading many to doubt Russia's version of events. Putin is over now that Ukraine has seized the Crimean Peninsula. Putin has thus claimed that any explosions on the Crimean Peninsula are accidental. War experts found humor in Russia's declarations. The most intriguing aspect of this is that flames have broken out not only in the territories Russia has acquired, but also in many other parts of the country. Fires have broken out, but they appear to be confined to buildings associated with the Russian military and unlikely to spread to residential areas. This strengthens the case that Ukraine is responsible for starting the flames. The devastating fire in the Moscow suburb of Khimki has sent shockwaves across the Kremlin. In the city of Khimki, a major fire broke out inside a retail mall. Since the mall hasn't opened to the public just yet, nobody was hurt. At first, everyone assumed that the fire was just another random blaze. But then they found out who owned the stores that had burned down. Many people say that Wagner Group goods were stored in the St. Petersburg warehouse where a fire broke out. It is speculated that Russia has sent weapons and ammunition to the territory of Ukraine, and that this warehouse is a depot from the Soviet era. Wagner soldiers, though, are known to illegally import and stockpile guns and ammo provided to them. Weapons and ammunition from World War II, it is said, can be found in great quantities. There are claims that Wagner soldiers transported weapons that Putin dispatched to Ukraine and sold them to various groups after storing them in this storehouse. The fact that Wagner mercenaries stole weapons from the Russian army will tip the scales in favor of the Russians and disprove all these stories. Yevgeny Prigozhin's life could be over if Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, believes that weapons have been taken from him. Russian General Sergei Surovikin was relieved of his duties shortly after Wagner declared that his soldiers had taken Soledar. Wagner CEO Yevgeny Prigozhin insulted Putin's intelligence by declaring that Wagner soldiers had conquered the city of Soledar, despite the Russian army's presence there. Russia's armed forces became increasingly disorganized as the battle dragged on. Many people of different ethnicities serve in the Russian armed forces. Minority soldiers who are fighting for the decrepit side of the war, despite their wishes, are having conversations with their Russian and Wagner counterparts. Insurrections broke out amongst the military's minority groups after they claimed they were denied enough supplies and weapons by the Russian government while serving in the battle zone. Actions and protests were taken because these soldiers, who were conscripted into the army by the decision of partial mobilization and deployed to the conflict in Ukraine against their will, felt neglected by Putin. These incidents, which occurred during the early stages of the war, have steadily increased in frequency inside the armed forces. However, Putin's oppressive approach was also implemented in the field. Russian leader Putin has instructed the commanders of individual units to eliminate any potential threat within the Russian armed forces. That is to say, the lives of minority soldiers are on the line whenever any action is taken within the army. This explains why reports of insurgency within the Russian armed forces have been scarce as of late. On the border with Belarus, the American military has begun preparations to confront Russian forces. President Joe Biden's decision to dispatch American troops has reportedly started to terrify Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. It has now been a year since Russian forces invaded and occupied Ukrainian territory. Russia and Ukraine's war, which began on December 24, 2014, is still active as of February 24 of the previous year. Many experts have predicted that the Russian army will quickly overrun the entirety of Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian army will be defeated in this conflict. Although Russia is 15 times larger than Ukraine in terms of both economy and military, the Ukrainian army was able to successfully fight Russian forces and prevent them from passing across the country. The countries who initially supported Ukraine but eventually joined the conflict are responsible for a sizable portion of the resistance. Russian President Vladimir Putin has just ordered the deployment of a considerable number of tanks, armored vehicles, S-400 air defense systems, and soldiers to the country of Belarus. Russian civilians observed and shared photographs of this weapons transfer, which was executed under Putin's direction. The mystery surrounding this military shipment dominated the conversation on social media. The deployment of Russian forces stationed in eastern Ukraine to the Belarusian border was called into serious doubt when these military shipments were made public. Vladimir Putin has been widely reported to be plotting a big strike. The question is whether or not Ukraine will be the target of this attack. Putin has amassed a considerable number of tanks, armored vehicles, and personnel on the border between Belarus and Poland, and this has prompted a response from the United States administration. Vladimir Putin, it is reported, will first call for a new mobilization in Russia before launching such an attack. Putin's earlier partial mobilization decision entailed enlisting 300,000 Russian nationals and sending them to fight in Ukraine. It is now expected that this figure will exceed 500,000. It has been reported that Putin's plan to fully mobilize the Russian armed forces will enlist more than 400,000 Russian civilians. According to Russian General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov, there are currently around 150,000 personnel in the Russian army. The Russian army will have roughly 550,000 soldiers with this figure. With this force, Vladimir Putin might launch a new invasion of Ukraine or Poland. The Russian army's airbase in Ukraine has been bombed to bits. The Russian military facility in the Kharkov region was destroyed by Ukrainian HIMARS rockets. The attack plan of Russian President Vladimir Putin has been foiled, costing Russia billions of euros. War between Russia and Ukraine escalated while the international community awaited the deconfliction of the conflict. The HIMARS missiles housed by the Ukrainian military at Izium have foiled a Russian military mission. The Russian army has not broken through the Ukrainian defenses on the Bakhmut front, where fighting is at its fiercest. In recent months, the Russian army has captured the Soledar region and driven the Ukrainian military out of the territory near the city of Bakhmut. With the help of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian army finally captured Soledar after months of trying without success. After leading Wagner mercenaries under his leadership to the city of Soledar, Prigozhin, a known friend of Vladimir Putin, created a strong Russian unit here. Wagner mercenaries fought alongside the Russian army for weeks before finally taking Soledar. To prevent losing Bakhmut as well, the Ukrainian army dug down behind a 15-kilometer defensive line after retreating to the city. The Russians had hoped to take Bakhmut as well, but the Ukrainian army put up such fierce fight that they were unable to even approach the city. The Russian High Command then made the decision to launch airstrikes against Bakhmut, where Ukrainian forces were concentrated. From Kharkiv, 2 Russian Su-25 fighter planes headed for the Bakhmut front. Ukrainian and British intelligence agencies worked together to successfully identify the location of the Russian air facility in Kharkiv and get photos of the base's resident fighter planes and helicopters. The operation was initiated by Ukrainian forces after coordinates and photographs were sent to commanders in the city of Izium. The HIMARS missile system was used by Ukrainian military to launch 8 missiles at the designated target. Kharkiv was under attack with HIMARS missiles, and they made it to the headquarters before anyone realized they had a Panzer-sewn defensive system there. 5 HIMARS missiles made it to their destination, but 3 were shot down by the Panzer-sewn air defense system. The airbase's Su-27 fighter plane and K-52 combat helicopter were destroyed by 3 HIMARS rockets. When one of the HIMARS missiles hit the airstrip at the airbase, A huge hole was created in the middle of the runway. The Russian forces lost both airplanes and helicopters, and the military airbase became unusable. With this operation of the Ukrainian army, one of the largest air bases of the Russian forces located on the territory of Ukraine, was destroyed. After the U.S. sent HIMARS missiles to the Ukrainian army began to conduct numerous air operations against Russian forces. Before the U.S. government sent Patriot and HIMARS missiles to the Ukrainian army, Russia was conducting airstrikes on many areas on Ukrainian territory, greatly damaging the Ukrainian army. The Russian army attacked residential areas in many regions of Ukraine, especially the capital Kiev, at the same time targeting infrastructure facilities in these regions, leaving Ukrainian citizens without electricity and water. Once part of the Ukrainian Air Force, this military airbase fell under Russian control after the city of Kharkiv was taken by the occupying Russian army. Every day, Russian forces pulled dozens of fighter planes out of this airstrip and used them to launch attacks against various parts of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government contacted the Ukrainian military leaders in Izium after deciding that this air facility must be destroyed. One area where the Ukrainian army has strengthened its presence is around the city of Izium, which has been freed from the occupation of Russian troops in recent months. To protect the safety of the Donetsk area, the Ukrainian military has dispatched a sizable force to the city of Izium, including numerous HIMARS, tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers. The city of Izium is home to HIMARS missiles that the Ukrainian army believed could be used to target the Russian military airbase in Kharkiv. Ukraine 52 Russian fighter jets were stationed on the Bakhmut front, and they fired 2 missiles in the direction of the artillery. The Russian jets were too far away, though, and their missiles missed the Ukrainian troop. The Russian pilots fully entered Bakhmut airspace to get a better shot, but they didn't account for the Patriot air defense systems that had been set up behind the front. As soon as the Russian fighter jets crossed into Bakhmut territory, the Patriots opened fire and began launching missiles at them. After briefly following the Russian bombers, the Patriot missiles with their targets locked on destroyed them. The second assault on Bakhmut was stopped when Russian fighter jets were shot down over the Atlantic. Russia's ground attempt to conquer Bakhmut failed. Thus, the country resorted to launching more and more airstrikes against the city. In response to Russian mobilization of their jets, the Ukrainian armed forces decided to launch an operation against the Kharkiv airbase. There has been a dramatic surge in the number of Russian officers and troops speaking out against Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian soldiers, especially those from ethnic minorities, who do not wish to fight in the country's eastern regions, are disarming in protest against Putin. Putin activated the Russian National Guard in response to an uptick in rebellions among the Russian armed forces. A big number of Russian soldiers have been detained by the Russian National Guard, which is responsible for quelling the protests in Ukraine. Russian National Guard squads capture and arrest Russian soldiers who refuse to fight or who attempt to flee the war. Wagner mercenaries are another issue within Ukrainian borders. Putin is having a hard time keeping the Wagner troops under control. These Yevgeny Prigozhin loyalists will not think twice about committing atrocities on Ukrainian soil. Wagner soldiers who broke into the homes of fleeing Ukrainian people and plundered received widespread attention after posting photos of their actions online. International tribunals have been asked by Western governments to help bring war criminal Yevgeny Prigozhin to justice for atrocities perpetrated in Ukraine by Wagner forces. A significant rebellion in Russia is unlikely unless Vladimir Putin issues another call to arms. The casualties caused by the Russian army on the territory of Ukraine are fueling the growing wrath of the Russian people towards Putin. From the earliest months of the conflict, the Russian people, who did not want to fight for Putin on Ukrainian soil, staged war and anti-Putin protests. However, Putin's security forces consistently foiled these citizen-organized protests in Russia. Putin has given the Russian security forces his complete approval in this matter. Therefore, they can't do anything inside Russian territory. A prison sentence will now be handed down to citizens who publicly protest the war on television or in the streets. During the conflict, numerous news outlets aired anti-war messages to make it clear they did not support the Russian invasion of Ukrainian land. However, these TV news anchors and correspondents were swiftly fired and put on trial for criminal charges. Putin's autocratic rule prevents any possibility of a popular movement in Russia. Putin's greatest worry is that the Russian people will launch another revolution. Putin can put down insurrections within Russia, but the Russian military in Ukraine is too strong for him to control. The deployment of Russian troops near the border with Belarus and Poland, however, has fueled speculation that Russia has its sights set not on Ukraine, but on Poland. Vladimir Putin's wrath is directed at Poland for its support of the Ukrainian army and its acceptance of a large number of Ukrainian residents. As a result, the Russian military might launch a fresh assault on Poland. It's no secret that Poland has felt the effects of Russian attacks on Ukrainian territory. Many of the Russian army's missiles missed their intended target in the Ukrainian army and instead landed in Poland. This has enraged the Polish administration. As a result of these assaults, the Polish army installed watchtowers and cameras along the border between Poland and Belarus to keep tabs on any and all Russian troop movements. Vladimir Putin's intentions appear to have been derailed as a result of the United States' deployment of troops to Poland. Conflict experts predict that tensions between Russian President Putin and Vice President Joe Biden will rise once again. Polish soldiers had been fortifying their frontiers since the war's outset in anticipation of a Russian invasion. Thus, the sight of Russian forces on the Belarusian border came as a shock. The Polish government did not believe Russian President Vladimir Putin's claims that there had been no attempt at invasion and that Russian and Belarusian troops were simply conducting a joint military drill. The U.S. military has been deployed to Poland in advance of a potential conflict with Belarus. On the border between Poland and Belarus, Polish and American forces have begun excavating fronts in preparation for a potential new Russian assault. Barbed wire is being installed on the border between Poland and Belarus with the help of American soldiers. U.S. troops, while bolstering border security with Poland, have also begun training Polish troops. The Polish Army has received a significant shipment of military supplies from the United States Department of Defense. U.S. troops are preparing to use new weapons, including portable anti-aircraft systems. The United States administration has said in recent weeks that Vladimir Putin will launch a military offensive on Ukrainian territory with 500,000 troops. The United States and other Western countries have provided substantial equipment support to the Ukrainian army since the earliest months of the conflict, with the tanks, armored vehicles, weapons, and unmanned combat aircraft it has obtained. The Ukrainian army has almost completely reconstructed the arsenal of the Ukrainian army. With their new arsenal, the Ukrainian army has decided to go on the offensive rather than defend against the invading Russian soldiers. The Russian military has lost a lot of ground in Ukraine and no longer has access to the resources it had in the early stages of the conflict. The Ukrainian military hopes to turn this situation around and has stepped up its operations against Russian occupied territory as a result. The United States, a major backer of the Ukrainian armed forces, has dispatched troops to Poland as the conflict with Russia escalates. Tensions between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden flared up again in December, as the United States military began preparing for the arrival of Russian forces in Poland. We now have a clearer idea of why the fire at the warehouse was so difficult to put out and why people avoided the area. It's lucky no one nearby was seriously hurt when the munitions warehouse exploded. Among the many concerns that have been brought up repeatedly is the possibility of deception within the Russian military. Many are confused by Sergei Surovikin's dismissal, as he was one of the commanders responsible for the invasion of Ukraine in recent months. The Russian leaders Surovikin and Prigozhin were allegedly in cahoots with one another. It is said that Prigozhin was responsible for the promotion of Russian General Surovikin to the position of commander of Russian forces, and that the two men worked together to smuggle weapons and ammunition out of the Russian army. Among the concerns voiced previously was the decapitation of the mercenary organization Wagner Group for stealing weapons and ammunition from the Russian army. However, Putin, the leader of Russia, did not spend much time discussing this. Russian oligarchs who have supported Putin since the start of the war had their stores, which they owned, destroyed by fire. It was a devastating loss for the Russian oligarchs whose mansions burned down in the conflagrations. Although the Russian government has not issued a comment regarding the fire, it is clear who lit it by examining who owns the stores that were destroyed. Considering the vast number of Crimeans who support the Ukrainian government, we can safely assume that the number of fires will rise. The Russian oligarchs, who had already taken a major hit, continued to take strike after blow. St. Petersburg, Russia. A mystery warehouse fire occurred in the city. The fact that the fire broke out when no one was in the warehouse to tend to it raised suspicions that it was set on purpose. No innocent bystanders were hurt in these attacks, which were likely carried out to punish Russia and punish business people who are working with the Russian government. Since the flames took so long to put out and the warehouses themselves couldn't be entered, speculation about their contents has only increased. Military experts in Ukraine are blamed for this explosion. At one point in the conflict, Ukrainian leader Zelensky had predicted that the peninsula of Crimea will once again be part of Ukraine. Recent activities on the Crimean Peninsula have prompted the occupying Russian military to begin fortifying their positions. Russian military are so worried about an impending operation in Crimea that they have set up new defensive positions along the border between Crimea and Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is expected to organize an offensive in Crimea, and these explosions and flames are considered as part of that plan. Shortly after the explosions on Turkish merchant ships docked in Crimea, these bombs went off. Researchers estimate that 1 in 15 Crimeans are Tatar Turks. It is possible that some of these people will join the Ukrainian resistance. While this is happening, similar attempts at sabotage are being made within Ukraine's borders as well. Insurgents from Ukraine have been successful in recent months in destroying Russia's major supply line in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin was severely damaged when Ukrainian separatists in the Kherson region successfully destroyed a railway link on which Russian soldiers were moving weapons and ammunition to Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. It has been extremely difficult for Russia to provide its troops in Ukraine with ammunition throughout this time. To safeguard its weaponry in Ukraine, the Russian military employs high-risk places like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear complex. Russian forces are hiding Russian armaments within the nuclear complex, risking a massive disaster because they know the Ukrainian army will not attack. On the other hand, a catastrophic nuclear explosion could result from the detonation of these weapons. U.S. authorities have expressed concern over this building, but the Russian military has persisted in using it as a supply store. For a long time, the Russian government has been relocating native-born Russians to areas with large minoritized populations. Those Russians who agree to settle in minority areas will be given a piece of property or a home in return. Putin's program has been in place for some time now, and it's unlikely that the high number of minority people serving in the military is a coincidence. However, minority citizens gradually came to terms with this reality and developed strong animosity for the Putin regime. This is why there are so many anti-Putin groups operating on the Crimean Peninsula. The vast majority of those who participate in these groups are dedicated to the mobilization choice. Citizens who are forced to hide from the Russian government are attempting to destroy Russian military installations in Crimea, such as ammo depots and headquarters, so that they might avoid going to fight in Ukraine. The Russian Air Force first successfully shot down a U.S. Now a Russian fighter plane has been shot down by a U.S. naval drone and a U.S. Air Force drone. Do the two countries' deconfliction signal the beginning of a new war? Conflicts between the United States and Russia, two of the most powerful militaries in the world, make Western nations uneasy. This conflict is a precursor to a new global war and could trigger a catastrophic event. Many military experts, however, argue that Russia is not capable of fighting such a conflict. He believes the Russian military is in a very vulnerable state right now and would be absolutely wiped out on Ukrainian soil if it engaged in another battle with the United States. This is why most people believe the Russian leadership will say nothing in response to the U.S. attack. Docking off the coast of the Crimean Peninsula has previously been used by the United States Navy as a threat to Russian cruisers stationed at the port of Sevastopol. The presence of U.S. Navy vessels in the Black Sea prompted Vladimir Putin, Russia's leader, to order the withdrawal of Russian ships from the port of Sevastopol. After this downed fighter jet, the Russian government has not yet commented. The U.S. Navy personnel, though, was adamant about remaining in the area. U.S. naval leaders opted to eliminate the Russian airplanes after they were harassed for hours by a Su-25 fighter jet. HIMARS missiles launched from military ships successfully targeted the Russian fighter jet. The Russian pilot desperately sought to escape as missiles bore down on his fighter jet. However, only minutes later, a Russian Su-25 fighter jet was destroyed in a massive explosion caused by a HIMARS missile. To ensure his own survival, the Russian pilot of the downed plane leapt from the aircraft. The United States claimed after the shoot down of the Russian fighter jet that the Russian pilots were harassing and attacking American naval vessels. The Pentagon has said that there are no threats aboard the U.S. Navy ships now in the Black Sea. The ship's mission is to locate the remains of the U.S. drone that was shot down by Russia. Despite Russian warplanes DC decrying the threat in the vicinity, U.S. ally Turkey backed these remarks by saying that the U.S. authorized passage via the Bosphorus Strait to aid search for wreckage, and that Turkey also engaged in the search for debris. Many war analysts think that if the Russian people found out about these losses, a major uprising would start in Russia. According to the allegations, Putin is afraid to share this data with the public because he is afraid that the Russian people will rebel. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, shares the Russian army's casualty data in an up-to-date manner every month. The Ukrainian government, which made a statement again recently, stated that the Russian army's troop losses in Ukraine exceeded 155,000. If Russia continues to suffer losses in Ukraine in this way, it seems that it will not be able to find troops to fight in Ukraine anytime soon. For this reason, Vladimir Putin seems to want to make a new mobilization decision in Russia. With the increasing claims that Putin will launch a new attack on Ukraine, the Russian people are very afraid that a mobilization decision will be announced again. Not only that, but the fires and explosions that have recently appeared within the borders of Russia have started to make the Russian people very nervous. Although Vladimir Putin says that these explosions and fires occurred as a result of an accident, the Russian people have difficulty trusting Putin's words. The explosion of a Russian gas pipeline in an area close to Moscow in recent weeks has scared the Russian people quite a lot. The natural gas pipeline that started burning exploded due to the fire and made a big noise. Although Russian citizens believe that these sabotages were carried out by Ukrainian insurgents, Russian leader Vladimir Putin says that these fires occurred as a result of an accident. Putin, who wants to prevent the Russian people from being afraid, continues to deceive the Russian people with the Russian media he owns. Putin, who does not even explain the losses of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory, does not want to inform the Russian people under the pretext that this is a state secret. Due to this war crime committed by Russian forces, the Ukrainian people had to live without water and electricity for days. However, after the Ukrainian army began using HIMARS missiles, it began to respond to Russian forces. With the arrival of HIMARS missiles to the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian forces first carried out a major operation on the Russian air base located on the Crimean Peninsula. With this operation, there were large explosions at the Russian air base on the Crimean Peninsula. With this operation of the Ukrainian army, 4 Russian Su-25 fighter jets were destroyed and Russia suffered billions of dollars in damage. The next operation of the Ukrainian army was to Belgorod, Russia. The Russian ammunition depot in the city of Belgorod, located on the Russian border with Ukraine, was destroyed by HIMARS missiles of the Ukrainian army.